Oh, shit. Here we go again.
And by the way, this is, maybe we'll come back to this another time, this is the bane of a number of revisionist theories, right? And when I was more revisionist than I am now, this was the problem. This was the problem that always bothered me. This was the one loose end, well, maybe there were others, but this was...
He's just standing there, menacingly!
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, this is your brother Leafy was here. Now about 3 weeks ago, I made a video refuting Ustaz Dr. Joshua Little on the origin of Isnads. That video exposed Joshua as the dishonest pseudo-scholar he is. If you haven't seen it already, make sure to check it out. The link to it will be in the description. Now since then, Ustaz Joshua and his army of bootlicking Reddit mods have been in shambles trying to respond to my video. They made not one but two Reddit threads on r/academic Quran to try and refute my video, and they all failed miserably. Now let's go through some of these Reddit threads to see if there's any sign of intelligent life. Here we have a nice comment from ItchyCrest4398. He says, quote, "Bro, thanks for references. I will put it in my work. Just like references of people who are defending reliability of hadiths. But honestly, this works that they wrote are, I will be king and say, of very small value for history." Why? Well, if all hadith corpus is standing on basics like, and then he just regurgitates some like refuted Orientalist arguments, and all three premises are wrong, and he can't, what happened, bro? You couldn't finish highlighting the G. So how can someone say that hadiths and seerah are valuable sources for Islamic history when all three I mean, come on, I'm sorry I had to put you guys through that, but just so you guys like understand the level of stupidity and incompetence that I'm dealing with here. This guy can't even structure a sentence coherently, and these are the geniuses that want to refute Sunni traditionalism. I mean, come on. Then we also have ignoramuses like Chonk, who's a level 50 Reddit mod, fighting with his other fellow Reddit mods on who can best lick Joshua's boots, which is also fun to see and watch. Chonk was then subsequently embarrassed again on Twitter, where he got cooked by me and Dean Responds. He also declined to come on a panel and discuss these issues publicly, preferring instead to be a keyboard warrior.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
Needless to say that Chonk's performance was very embarrassing to Ustaz Joshua. I mean, the guy was ignorant on John Burden's works, which are staple works in the revisionist school. The link to this thread will of course be in the description. Needless to say that the response by Chonk and his fellow bootlicking Redditors was embarrassing. So Joshua felt the need to come out of his little man cave and respond to the points made in the video, or at least attempt to respond. Now this brings us to today's events, where we're going to be reading and responding to Ustaz Joshua's rebuttal of my video. So let's begin by first reading the preface given by Chonk, and then we'll go through the arguments one by one and see if there's any substantive rebuttal that needs to be addressed. Recently, I contacted the hadith historian, Ustaz Joshua Little, to understand why the field thinks Isnads originated in the 7th century. You can find his detailed explanation for that here. This post focuses on a new video titled Exposing Oxford Scholar Dr. Joshua Little on the Origin of Isnad, released by Leafy Was Here and his corresponding team of Muslim apologists. That's crazy, bro. I didn't know I had a team of Muslim apologists. For the record, I make everything by myself. I edit by myself. I research by myself. I do everything by myself. So does he think my video was so well produced and so thoroughly researched that it must have been a team of apologists? Like, that's the only explanation? I mean, I'll take it as a compliment. I should note that Leafy Was Here's video addresses very little of the overall case for the late date in the academic literature, focusing instead on brief comments made by Joshua in some interviews. Yeah, well, I mean, the issue is if I address all the stupidity that comes out of the revisionist school of thought, I'm going to be here for like, no kidding, like 10 hours. I have a life, I have things to do. And this is genuinely, it's just not my position. It's more of the position of scholars to go through every little detail. However, is Leafy's critique of Little's presentation correct? To answer that, I sent these arguments to Ustaz Joshua himself. And so let's go through some of his responses.
Right now, I want to completely stay away from motivations and just deal with the arguments and the evidence. And at the end, we can come back to that after we've dealt with that, right? So right now, we're going to not think at all about motive. And we're just going to look at the arguments and the evidence.
Alright guys, so for each argument, I'm going to assume you guys are familiar with the context and that you've already watched my previous video, because otherwise I'm just going to have to keep repeating myself, which is going to make the video be longer than it should be. Okay, so for the first argument, here he's talking about my critique of his analogy, talking about World War I and World War II. He says that the most obvious thing that he'd be referring to is the second fitnah, because that's the one that's closest to him. And I respond by saying that no, the one that with the greatest impact is actually the one that we would expect him to be talking about. So this is what he says. He says, against this you argue that the first fitnah had the greatest impact and is thus more expected as the default meaning of an unqualified use of the term fitnah. This is anachronistic thinking. So he charges me of thinking anachronistically. And he says this reflects classical long-term perspective that Sunnism, Shi'ism and Kharijism all emerged from the first fitnah. Now again, we don't believe this. We don't believe that Sunnism emerged from the first fitnah. We don't even believe that Shi'ism emerged from the first fitnah. Neither do we believe that Kharijism emerged from the first fitnah. This is definitely, it exacerbated those drifts in the community, but Shi'ism, proto-Shi'ism was already existing before that, according to our narrative, and so was Kharijism. Kharijism or proto-Kharijism already existed before the first fitnah. It just became more pronounced and exacerbated by the events of the first fitnah. Likewise, Sunnism has always been there from the beginning. So this guy's a jahil. He doesn't even understand what he's talking about. And then he just starts talking about the second fitnah and how it was more bloody. He talks about Harra. He talks about the killing of Hussein, how there was looting and all these violent things. And he concludes by saying, therefore, we remain justified in thinking that for the people in the decades following such an explosive conflict, it would be the default referent for the word fitnah. Now, this is stupid for a bunch of reasons. First of all, this accusation of anachronistic thinking is laughable. I'll tell you why. Because every accusation is a confession with this guy. What he does is he takes a Kufan 8th century context and he superimposes that on a 7th century Basran context. So he's the one actually thinking anachronistically. I'm not thinking anachronistically. I'm just looking at the eyewitnesses and seeing what they're saying, and they're all talking about it in terms of the first fitnah. So who are the eyewitnesses that I'm talking about? I'm talking about the Risala of Al-Hasan bin Muhammad al-Hanafiya. He's there in the 1st century, all before, these are all before 90 AH by the way, and he talks about the fitnah in reference to the first fitnah. Ibn Sirin himself, as he grants himself, he says that yes, he uses the term fitnah to be in reference to the first fitnah, and he grants this. He has no problem granting that. So again, that's another witness from the 1st century who uses the word fitnah without qualification to be in reference to the first fitnah. Then we have people like Al-Shabi, which is recorded in Ibn Sa'd, for example, and he also uses the word fitnah without qualification. So all three of these are earlier than 90 AH, and they're independent of each other, and they all use the term fitnah without qualification to be in reference to the first fitnah. So we have a precedent, which is that the default usage of the word fitnah without qualification naturally refers to the one with the greatest significance and impact, which is the first fitnah. And you have to also realize that Ibn Sirin is a Basran. So Ibn Sirin is surrounded by people who are Basrans who participated in Jamal and in Siffin. So naturally, he's going to be growing up with these people who are still traumatized and who are still living through the impact of that trauma. So naturally, when he's growing up and they're all using the word fitnah to refer to Jamal and Siffin and the martyrdom of Uthman, naturally he's going to take that from them as well. So again, all of these arguments are pathetic. So this is a terrible response. This is a terrible response. The accusation of anachronism is laughable, and it's actually, he's the one who's being anachronistic because, like I said, he's imposing a 8th century Kufan standard on a 7th century Basran. So that's literally the definition of anachronism. And then, in terms of saying that the second fitnah was more bloodier, well, I mean, we have so many evidences against this. So I'll put up a hadith right now, which refutes him. So here's the hadith from Ibn al-Musayyib. He said, when the first civil strife occurred, وقعت الفتنة الأولى, the first one, i.e. the assassination of Uthman, the maqtal of Uthman, the killing of Uthman, not one of those who had been at Badr remained. So all the people of Badr who participated at Badr, the 313, they're all dead. When the second fitna occurred, right, i.e. the Harra, not one of those who had been at Hudaybiyah remained. So again, he's giving you the chronology. So this hadith is Sahih, Bukhari transmits it, all the people in it are thiqah. It's also reported independently by Abdul Rahman bin Abdullah. Utaybiyah also transmits it. So does Ibn Abi Shayba and Abu Nu'aym as well. So we have 3 independent lines. So Ustaz Joshua can't cope by saying that these are Marwanid era fabrications. This hadith also shows that major Basran jurists and Ibn Sirin's contemporaries already treated the first fitna as the most important event, not the second fitna. So an unqualified usage of the word in that context would naturally invoke the earliest rupture in the community. More importantly, however, it shows that bloodiness or vulgarity of an event didn't override the chronology proposed, because very clearly you say that harra is more bloody or vulgar than the first fitna, but yet the chronology proposed here by this Basran shows that he did not consider that to override the primacy of what he considered to be the first fitna. So again, this shows that the bloodiness of the second fitnas did not in any way overcome the fact that people still thought that the first fitna was much more impactful and meaningful. Again, so this is very clear. All right, now let's go to the second point. So he says, Palfovich cites the hadith of Ibrahim al-Nakhaʿ. The Isnad was only asked for in the beginning of the days of al-Mukhtar. He then notes that the rise of the Mukhtar is probably hard in the hadith of sectarian. So again, he just repeats Palfovich's nonsense. And then he says, all of this is dismissed as pure conjecture and incorrect in your argument. But why? Why are you dismissing my conjecture as conjecture? Why are you calling a spade a spade? This is a standard way of inferring an author's collective view, known as composition criticism. Yeah, again. So he's just throwing out a nice buzzword and hoping people doesn't understand, like, what does this mean? What is composition criticism? Composition criticism demands demonstrable editorial intent, which this work lacks. So what he ends up doing is just taking something from one context and superimposing it on another context without reason. So it's almost like if you read a cookbook and the cookbook has one chapter talking about desserts and then the next chapter is talking about, steak or whatever. And then you say, because the previous chapter was talking about, apple pie, therefore I need to put apple pie in my steak. This is literally the same exact reasoning. I'm being crude, but it's the exact same reasoning. Now, when al-Juzajani is reading, when he's formatting his work, he's not writing it in terms of, he's not thinking what you're thinking. He's not writing, this is, Bab al-Mukhtarites. This is, the sector talking about the Mukhtarites. If there was a section talking, okay, these are all the hadith talking about the Mukhtarites, and then he lists the hadith of Ibn Sirin under that bab, under that section, then you would have a point, because then he's trying to say that there's some connection between the Mukhtarites and the hadith of Ibn Sirin, but that's not actually the case. So again, this is a weak appeal to justification, and he even admits it, because he says, look here, he says Palfovich's interpretation, he is reasonable and makes sense in the context of the evidence and the considerations just outlined. Of course, it is certainly true that by itself, this potential piece of evidence certainly would not be strong. For example, we could posit other intentions on al-Juzajani's part, which is what I just said. However, in combination with all the other consideration, this point helps to strengthen the case. So he even accepts that this point is flimsy. It's weak. It's not convincing. But he says, this is a corroborating factor. This is something that is in confluence with our case, so I'm going to use it. So essentially what he's doing is grasping at straws.
But this is, from what I can tell, some of these arguments are they just seem so bad. It's not even worth engaging with. It's like, oh.
Do you ever look at someone and wonder what is going on inside their head?
The way he's arguing is, no kidding, the same way like people who deny the moon landing argue. What they do is they'll take, I'm not even joking, like this is what they'll do. They'll say, didn't you see that the flag of the moon is shaking? It's wobbly, right? And that could only be there if there was wind. But on the moon, there's no wind. So therefore, how is it that the flag, is shaking? And that's one shubha. They'll get you that one doubt. Then they'll take this other piece of conjecture and they'll say, oh, well, look at the camera lens. It's reflecting and there's light. So why is there light reflecting in space? It doesn't really make sense. Therefore, they'll get you another shubha. And they'll get you 3 or 4 of these potential doubts. And then by the end of it, they'll reach the conclusion that the moon landing is fake. This is genuinely what he's doing. He's taking one shubha here, one shubha there, and he's mixing it together. And by the end, he's reaching this stupid conclusion, which is that this hadith is referring to the second fitna, not the first fitna. Also, he can just say that the Islamic sources are unreliable. All of this, so he can say the Islamic sources are unreliable and Isnad arose later, and we have no reason to trust hadith, etc., etc. Now, he says, all of this is dismissed as pure conjecture and incorrect, but why? I'll tell you why. Because you're reading into the text something that's not there. That's why it's conjecture.
The amount of reading in here is unreal.
I can read the same text al-Juzajani wrote and not come to the conclusion that he's talking about the Mukhtarites. And you accept that that's a possibility. And in fact, that's the more natural reading of the text. Your reading is unnatural. So that's why it's dismissed as conjecture. We have other counter evidences from earlier critics that just simply omit this phrase. I mean, Ibn Sa'd quotes the same hadith without without applying it to al-Mukhtar. So we have other muhaddithin that are earlier than al-Juzajani or contemporary to al-Juzajani who simply cite this hadith in a different context. For example, he cites it in the context of the Khawarij. So you're going to say now this hadith is referring to the Khawarij. Your line of reasoning can easily be turned against you. So I think people see that, and Joshua himself is conceding that this is a very weak argument and that by itself it doesn't hold a candle, but he's just trying to grasp at straws and say, oh well, there's some considerations. And you'll genuinely get this with how Joshua argues. He, for example, like in his response about the 21 reasons why hadith are weak or hadith are historically problematic, he'll give you like 21 reasons, and the first 7 are just nonsense. The first 7 are weak. They make no sense. The first 7 is like, other people fabricated, therefore we expect the Muslims to be fabricating. Just outright fallacious reasoning. He knows it's fallacious. He says, therefore we have an a priori, assumption that just because other contemporaries were forging and fabricating, therefore the Muslims must have also been forging and fabricating. It's literally a non sequitur. It's a fallacious argument, but he'll still use it. The point is, he wants to overwhelm you with a bunch of little evidences that most people are not going to be familiar with. And then, because they're not familiar with it, they'll succumb. They'll eventually concede, right? But if you actually go through each one by itself, just like with the moon landing, if you go through each evidence that they claim supports their position, you'll realize that it's flimsy. It doesn't support their position at all. I mean, I'd also like to point out that he says that the Juzajani report confirms his hypothesis because of the Ibrahim al-Nakhaʿ report, but he's just assuming that refers to the second fitnah. Again, he's arguing in a circle, because the whole thing that we're arguing, the whole thing that I'm contesting, is that these reports are not in reference to the second fitnah. Instead, they're in reference to the first fitnah, or they're just inauthentic. But he's assuming the authenticity of the first report and just trying to anachronistically superimpose it onto another author living in a different context, talking about something completely different. So again, he's just arguing in a circle here as well.
How do you explain this? How do you get around this? And I could never think up a good explanation really around this kind of problem, which is...
So I don't think, to be honest, I don't think the first response or the second response is anything that is going to... I don't think either of these two responses are going to be convincing to any people. I think the only people who are going to eat this up are probably his brain-dead Redditors. Anyone else with half a brain is going to realize that this is all like fluff. This is all nonsense. So let's go to the third response. He says here that he talks about al-Juzajani, and then I brought up the criticism of Jarallah in his dissertation Origins, where he accuses Juynboll of inconsistency because Juynboll accepts reports that are recorded in Abbasid sources, and he's cherry-picking reports that suit him. And he says that Juynboll often used the criterion of dissimilarity, and Juynboll is not actually saying that all the reports are about the second fitnah are authentic. Right? His point is that still in the earlier sources there is an impression, obviously an archaic one, that the word fitnah was associated first and foremost with the second fitnah. So he accepts here that most of the reports that Juynboll surveys are actually inauthentic. So here there's a very big issue. So the sources that Juynboll relies on are predominantly Kufan. Now, even if I grant you, first of all, I don't grant this, but even if I did, let's pretend like I grant you that what you're saying is correct and that the usage in Kufa is generally talking about the second fitnah because they're traumatized by the events of al-Mukhtar and Abdullah bin Zubair and etc., right? Let's grant that this is the case. What does that tell you about Basra? The Basran cluster is a completely different cluster than the Kufan cluster. So how are you superimposing or extrapolating from Kufa to Basra? That's not methodologically sound. Now, that's the first issue, which I don't think you can address or get past. The most you can say is, yeah, well, it's an assumption that, the people in Basra are also thinking the same way the Kufans are thinking, or at least using the same terms that the Kufans are thinking. But again, I don't think that's an assumption that I have to share or accept because you haven't provided any independent corroboration for that. The second point is a much more fundamental point, which is that we have earlier counterexamples that I gave you. Again, at least 4 of them that I can think of off the top of my head, which completely undermine this theory. He himself later admits that this weakens the theory of Juynboll, and he says that this is a sideshow and it doesn't actually matter. And again, appealing to the criterion of dissimilarity doesn't mean Juynboll is not cherry-picking, because how he applies the criterion of dissimilarity is also critiqued by Jarallah. Don't think Jarallah is not aware of Juynboll's use of the criterion of dissimilarity. You think Jarallah doesn't understand this? He doesn't understand what HCM is? He understands you're using the principle of analogy and dissimilarity, and he understands exactly how you guys approach. His whole dissertation is talking about the Western approach to hadith. So he is very familiar with the tools that at your disposal that you're using. So You saying that Jarallah is not understanding Juynboll is a complete straw man of Jarallah's position. Jarallah does understand he's using the criteria of dissimilarity, but he's saying even that is used inconsistently. He's inconsistent with the Isnads, he's inconsistent with where he cherry picks his sources from, and he's inconsistent on how he uses the criteria of dissimilarity. And if you read Jarallah's book, which I'm going to put on my server, by the way, so make sure you guys check that out if you're interested, you can go through it and you can see on what criteria he rejects each report. So I might have a picture of that up on the screen right now. So again, all of this is grasping at straws, trying to say that, people use the word fitnah in the context of the second fitnah. Therefore, we have this reasonable expectation that Ibn Sirin is talking about the second fitnah, despite the fact that he himself clarifies that he's talking about the first fitnah. I also don't think this is particularly convincing. Again, it's just extrapolation, assumptions, arguing in a circle, and anachronistic thinking. Also, methodological inconsistencies here by Juynboll. So again, here is why I say that Juynboll and Joshua are actually the ones committing anachronism. Because what is he doing here? What he's doing is retrojecting a Kufan lexical pattern onto a 7th century Basran narrator, while simultaneously trying to dismiss the Basran evidence as late.
This was the big problem for me. How do you get around this problem? And I could never think of a good solution, right? So eventually you just have to go with the evidence, right? And then
what we call that is special pleading. That's what he's doing. He's just special pleading. Why is it the case that your anachronism is fine, but my supposed anachronism, which isn't really anachronism, again, I give you early witnesses that agree with my understanding, that's not fine. It's very weird. It's very weird. And this is evidenced by the fact that Juynboll retracted his position and began trying to reinterpret the word fitnah. So he himself kind of tacitly conceded that, this position is clearly not one that is convincing. And again, this type of argument from silence that these revisionists love to rely on is, again, methodologically weak, because they're trying to infer that because many compilations happen to quote the fitnah in the context of the revolt of Abdullah bin Zubair, that therefore the earlier usage for Uthman was unknown or scarce or, basically absent from the sources. And Jarallah calls this out in his actual thesis. He says that the absence of quotations in surviving fragments doesn't necessitate the absence of contemporary usage. So when direct first century texts, like for example the Risala or Ibn Sa'd or any of the other sources that I'm giving you, directly contradict this. So again, this is very weak. I don't think anyone is going to be convinced by this. Oh yeah, and for the first argument, I forgot to mention that it just came to me now, that the second fitnah, all the stuff that he talks about here, is literally all of that is derivative of the first fitnah. Like the Shi'i revolt, that's derivative of the first fitnah. The killing of Hussein is also derivative of the first fitnah. The revolt of al-Mukhtar is derivative of the first fitnah. All of these things are like mainly derived from the first fitnah. So even within the uses, the examples that he cites, they all point to the fact that the first fitnah is the one that is actually more relevant and more important. So again, it's more likely that they'd be referring to that. And the analogy with World War I and World War II, it still doesn't follow. I don't think he even tries to defend the analogy. He just says, here, if someone refers to the war World War II, they're likely referring to World War II, not World War I. Again, this is a disanalogy, and he doesn't defend the fact that it's not a disanalogy. He just regurgitates it. Okay, so let's go to the fourth point. He says there's a lot of back and forth between Juynboll, Van Es, Jarallah concerning the word fitnah, and here Dr. Little recaps some of the issue. And he says that this entire debate is a sideshow. Most of the scholarship and argumentation in favor of the origins of the Isnad is in the second fitnah, is interpreting this hadith this way, blah, 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 blah. So what he's saying is essentially, most revisionist scholars agree that it's talking about the second fitnah, so this point is relevant. No, it's actually very relevant, because what it shows is that your methodology is flawed and inconsistent and that you're a hypocrite. That's exactly what it shows. So I know you want to pivot away from showing the flaws of your methodology, but that's not what we're here to do. So he concedes that the more fundamental point derived from Juynboll's survey is that the term fitnah was used often to mean the second fitnah in the earliest extant sources and the cited traditions, except for the ones that I've given you, which contradict that, which means that it's plausible at the outset that Ibn Sirin's hadith could be referring to the second fitnah. Whether or not it actually does refer to the second fitnah depends on the arguments outlined below, not specifically on Juynboll's survey. Yeah, so he seems to say that, when we cherry pick, that's just a sideshow. That's not really important. What's more important is what do the earliest extant sources say. Yeah, I agree with you. The earliest extant sources are in our favor. They're not in your favor. They don't agree with you that Ibn Sirin is referring to the second fitnah, or as you call him, pseudo Ibn Sirin. But why is this not important? Why is this not important? If it wasn't important, why is Juynboll bringing it up to further support his conclusion? I know you think the key takeaway is whether or not the word fitnah is used within the context of the second fitnah, but I think these points are also very important. Whether the term fitnah was used more to mean the second fitnah rather than the first, or his conclusion that the term fitnah was applied to the first, applied first to the second fitnah and only secondarily to the first fitnah, that is important, and it does kind of give you a bias of which way you want to interpret the hadith of Ibn Sirin, because it determines the normative use of the word fitnah, which is what we're trying to understand here, which is what is under contention. So if you saying it's a sideshow just because it exposes, your favorite scholar Juynboll's hypocrisy, this isn't a good justification at all. Yeah, Joshua, yeah, Habibi. It's not a good justification for you to say that this is a sideshow. I agree with you that the earliest extant sources are important, and that's why I'm quoting them to refute you. All right, let's go to the next
Flashback.
We also have one or two, some variants of this hadith that add in a detail saying, in the early period. So it's the first fitnah. Well, why are they doing that? If it's just obvious that this is the first fitnah, why did you have to add that in? That's consistent with, it's sort of like, methinks this hadith protesteth too much, right? It's like, they're sort of compensating and trying to make it clear. No, it's the first fitnah. That implies that people think it's the second fitnah. Nope. They're trying to emphasize it's the first fitnah.
Oh no, you're retarded.
But essentially what he was doing, or he was implying heavily that the addition here is made as a type of cover-up or with the intention of deceiving the author, or he was generally talking in this type of conspiratorial tone, and I was calling him out for it. So what does he respond? And then he talks about it going back to Nadr, and Nadr is the one who introduced this wording, and he says, I argue that the very fact that al-Nadr felt the need to clarify the events in the hadith occurred in the earliest period can be taken to imply that there were other people who thought that the events occurred in a later period, i.e. in relationship to the second fitnah. This is a reasonable inference. How is it reasonable, Joshua? He says, when people emphasize that X is Y, it often implies there are other people who think that X is not Y. And he also says, we also happen to know this is the case thanks to the reports about al-Mukhtar. So again, he's banking a lot. I want you to keep in mind, he's banking a lot on the hadith of Ibrahim al-Nakhaʿ, the athar of Ibrahim al-Nakhaʿ. He's trying to interpret all that data to be in line with that. He really thinks that the hadith of Ibrahim al-Nakhaʿ is what is the linchpin, is that keeps everything together. Up until this point, everything that he's brought has been completely terrible, flimsy, even by his own admission. I don't think he believes the nonsense he was saying before, right? He calls the other stuff a sideshow. He says that by itself it's not weak. He concedes, basically up until this point, he's just been conceding my points. But he is saying, look, it's completely reasonable for you to say that just because one group is emphasizing that X is Y, that means that there are people who are saying that this is the opposite. Now, look, this is plausible. I'm not going to say this is impossible. No, this is plausible. It could be the case that he's adding it there because another group was disputing this. That's possible. But it's also possible that there are other reasons that he put it there. For example, it could have just been a common practice to clarify what you mean. Very simple. Another explanation is that people no longer, his students that he's teaching, because remember he has a bunch of students that he's teaching, and they constantly ask him, which fitnah? So instead of just repeating himself over and over again, he just feels, okay, it's better for me to add it in the gloss. That's another explanation. So we can posit alternative reasons that don't necessitate another group existing that disputes it. So this is a plausible interpretation, but you haven't actually given any evidence to support this. So it's possible in theory, but it's not practical. You haven't given any evidence of this. So until you do give evidence that there is a group that was disputing that, and that's the reason why he felt the need to add in that wording, then this is, again, just pure speculation. This is not any evidence that is, worth anything. I mean, and also while I'm thinking about it, Nadr died like 200 something, I think 210, something like that. So he's living in the 3rd century, and this is his edition according to you. So this is an edition from the 3rd century. Yet you want to superimpose that onto what Basran scholars thought 120 years before him. So you're understanding that this is a secondary edition, but yet he treats it as if it tells you anything about 1st century, the context in the 1st century. He accuses me of anachronism, but this is, again, he's the one falling into anachronism. Then he says, the response amounts to the assertion that I'm positing the occurrence of a mass conspiracy, or the implication that you were giving off is that you're talking in a conspiratorial way, saying, perhaps this hadith protests of too much, and you're, rubbing your hands and you're getting all excited because you're thinking that this supports you when it really doesn't. And then he concedes. So regardless of that, let's pretend like, fine, you weren't, even though you were, but let's pretend like you weren't, being conspiratorial and whatever. he concedes. He says, there is no need to posit that al-Nadr was deliberately being deceitful when he altered the wording of the version of Ibn Sirin's hadith. It could be that Nadr simply thought he was bringing out the correct meaning of the context. Exactly. So if you agree with me that he's just harmonizing it, or, there's another possible explanation for this, then why are you trying to pretend that this tells you anything about the first century? It doesn't. All right, now let's go to response number 6. So again, this is plausible in theory. Like, this point here is plausible in theory, but there is no evidence of this. So until that he brings evidence of this, then it's just an assumption that we don't have to take. And again, we can posit simpler reasons for why al-Nadr would feel the need to clarify. And a 3rd century editorial edition tells us nothing about what the 1st century context was like in Basra. So again, this is anachronism. All right, now let's move on to argument number 6. Now this is where it gets even juicier, guys. So let's move on to what has been... So far, all the arguments that I've made, so my 4 critiques of him, my first one was the disanalogy between World War I, World War II, and the first fitnah and the second fitnah. That's true. I think that's self-evidently true. The second issue of misquoting al-Juzajani and misrepresenting his position, reading into him, that's also true. He concedes that it's weak and flimsy. The third point about positing a conspiracy, speculating about the motive of the addition of a Nadr is also correct. I think he's pretending like it's a conspiracy when we can postulate simpler explanations. And again, his usage of that evidence is anachronistic, so there's no need for us to... there's no corroboration for that theory. And then finally, the 4th piece of evidence, which is al-Mukhtar, which is what we're going to get to. So far, the 3 evidences that he's critiqued, all of them have been successful. Like, he hasn't refuted anything that I've said. He's pretty much tacitly conceded like the first point and the third point, and then the second point he's explicitly conceded it. So let's move on here. And then the point about Juynboll, he said it's a sideshow and it's irrelevant. So again, all right, let's move on to argument number 6. Let's move on to what has been proposed as positive evidence for the claim that Ibn Sirin was referring to the first fitnah, not the second. Right. So first of all, he gives the 2 points that I gave. I gave 3, but we'll get to the third point later. He says, first of all, I give a hadith where Ibn Sirin specifies that the fitnah to Abdullah bin Zubair when he talks about the fitnah. So this shows that when he wants to talk about the second fitnah, he'll specify it. And then the second point was I gave a hadith talking attributed to Ibn Sirin where he says that the fitnah erupted and there were 10,000 companions which took part in it. And with all these companions still alive, clearly he's talking about the first fitnah. So the chronology doesn't match. Let's see what he says in response. So he analyzes the Isnads and he tries to say that this doesn't go back to Ibn Sirin. The first hadith cannot be traced back to Ibn Sirin and used as evidence for his usage patterns. Okay, fine, let me grant you that that's the case. I don't believe that's the case, but let me grant that that's the case. So what? The chain is not solitary. This meta-analysis goes both ways, ya Ustaz Little. For you guys, some Orientalists don't even care about the Isnad to begin with. They focus purely on the matan. So even if I grant, let's say this isn't to Ibn Sirin, it's pseudo Ibn Sirin. So what? It still shows the usage pattern where people would distinguish between the first fitnah and the second fitnah, and it still shows that people at that time would distinguish when they wanted to talk about the second fitnah. They would specify it. They would say fitnah to Abdullah bin Zubair, even if you say this isn't Ibn Sirin. That doesn't change the point. He also says that this is kind of a prophecy hadith and it advocates a quietist doctrine, and these are really, really lame excuses for rejecting a hadith, yeah, Joshua. I mean, this is very pathetic. To me, this is like a tacit admission that of his defeat. And I'll explain to you why. First of all, just because a hadith is prophetic, that doesn't mean that it's forged necessarily. You can have a prophetic hadith that is not forged. Why is it? Let's assume that the hadith is a prophecy. So what? It means that someone prophesies something. Is that impossible, yani? Is that something that's so unreasonable for a man to prophesy something? There's no reason for you to a priori, yani, dismiss it just because there's a prophecy in it. The report is not even a prophetic foretelling, but it's just Ibn Sirin recalling Ubaida's advice, which is to sell your land. That's what it is. There is no forgery here.
Most of the time, it's just pure assertion. They're just waving on magic wand. When magic steps in one and saying, "Oh, we'll just later interpolations." Oh, really? Well, what's the argument? For most of them, there's no argument. They just wave a magic wand, say, "Oh, they're abracadabra, they're all waving," right? Yeah, it's unbelievable, right? Now there is one.
He doesn't give any evidence of a forgery. He just says, "Oh, it's a prophetic hadith, so it could be forged." Yeah, this is weak. Likewise, quietist doctrine. I mean, look, if we hold this standard consistently, I want you guys to think about this. A quietist doctrine, what does that mean? It means he's advocating to not be involved, right? Now, we have a bunch of Sahabis who also advocated the quietist doctrine, who are apolitical. For example, the most famous of them is Ibn Umar. Ibn Umar, when the first fitna occurred, he was famously quiet. He famously didn't get involved in the Battle of Siffin. And when asked about it, he said the best thing to do is to abstain, because it's such a big fitna. And Ibn Taymiyyah praised him for this. Ibn Taymiyyah and all the other scholars, they praised him and they said, he is a haq, he is on the correct path. This is what the Sahaba should have done. This is the best response. When there's a major fitna between two Muslims, what you should do is abstain from it. If you can't bring them together, then abstain. Don't join one side. This is what the scholar said. So according to Joshua's standard, we should reject all the transmissions attributed to Ibn Umar. Is it that inconceivable, ya Joshua, that there's people who are apolitical in the early Muslim community? Is that something that's so out of this world, so difficult for you to believe? So this is again a pathetic reason for you to reject the hadith, because if you did, you'd have to reject all these reports. So you'd have to reject the reports attributed to Ibn Umar and all the other apolitical Sahabis. You'd have to be saying that all the Sahabis must be political. They must be politically involved, which is a very, very silly position. It's very, very unreasonable. And you'd also have to say, like, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, he's also fabricating hadith. Why? Because he's supporting the quietist doctrine. He's praising Ibn Umar. He's saying, yeah, this quietist doctrine is the correct thing to do. So therefore, Ibn Taymiyyah is also transmitting a quietist doctrine. He's advocating a quietist doctrine. Therefore, Ibn Taymiyyah's statements in Majmu' al-Fatawa were also fabricated. Yallah, be consistent. But you're not going to say that. You're going to say, oh no, we have good independent attestation, etc. Okay, it's the same here. So why are you? So this is not good reason to call this hadith fabricated. I'm granting him what he's saying, and even by granting him what he wants, he's still not getting very far. So this shows the weakness of his position. And again, I'm just going to put a nice quote here by Jonathan Brown, which kind of summarizes Little's mentality here, where he talks about the chicken and egg approach of the Western scholars, where, a hadith doesn't match our interest or doesn't seem right to us, therefore it must be fabricated. Like, this is the same level of arguments as Abu Huraira transmitted some misogynistic hadith, therefore I want to reject Abu Huraira. Or the hadith of the Prophet eating chicken, the hadith of Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, is fabricated because it was made up by someone who wanted to sell chickens. Again, this is the exact same chicken and egg logic. This is what Jonathan Brown calls it. So this reasoning for rejecting the hadith is very weak. Okay, but then he talks about the second hadith, and it's very hard for him to get out of this one. He says the second hadith can be plausibly attributed to Ibn Sirin, in my opinion. All right, I'm glad you agree. Given that it is co-attested by multiple chains, in other words, it seems reasonable to suggest that in one instance Ibn Sirin used the term fitnah to mean the first fitnah. So he concedes. He says Ibn Sirin used the term the fitnah to mean the first fitnah.
You're finished. You're finished. Wallahi, you're finished. Wallahi, you're
So if Ibn Sirin himself used the word the fitna to mean the first fitna, why should I think that the second time he's using it, he means the second fitna now, all of a sudden? Secondly, the hadith about 10,000 companions, accepting that it comes from Ibn Sirin, proves only that the term the fitna could be used to mean the first fitna already in the time of Ibn Sirin. Okay? This weakens a specific hypothesis posited by Juynboll, but not much else. It remains the case that the second fitna would be the more intuitive referent for the fitna in the decades following the second fitna. You haven't proved that, my friend. It remains the case that the term fitna was often used for the second fitna.
Wrong.
Again, you haven't proved that either, and the examples that I've given prove the opposite. It remains the case that there are similar hadith on the origins of Isnad that explicitly specify the second fitna. Okay. So what he says here is, you're right, I concede, but I have all this other evidence that I think supports my position, so this doesn't really matter. Essentially, that's what he's saying. Now, the other evidence is flimsy, fallacious, anachronistic, and very, very unconvincing. That's the rest of your evidence. So for you to dismiss something look how simple this hadith is. He can't even run from it. 10,000 companions. ثارة الفتنة وأصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم 10,000 لم يخف منهم 40 رجلا. And in some variations it says لم يخف منهم 30 رجلا. 30 men only participated in it. So again, this shows that at the time of the fitna, there were all these companions alive. So again, it corresponds with the first fitna, the siege of Uthman, and other variations clarify that it's the siege of Uthman. So he concedes. He says, it is probably genuine, and it does prove that he's talking about the first fitna, but it doesn't change anything else because we have this other flawed evidence that makes my hypothesis more likely, basically. I mean, literally, you can't make this up. He says, in short, one instance of Ibn Sirin using the term fitnah to mean the first fitnah changes very little, and it's not enough to overcome the other points of evidence and considerations. Well, considering that the other points and evidences that you bring are worthless, weak, conjecture, fallacious, anachronistic, why the hell would anyone care about them? Or take them seriously? This is embarrassing. People think this is a response, but this is literally him conceding. Half the points are him literally conceding and saying that half the points are him literally either tacitly or explicitly conceding my points and then trying to divert it away and just basically saying, oh, we have the hadith of Mukhtar, we have the hadith of Mukhtar, and that solves everything.
Now you've humiliated yourself. With all due respect to you, that you don't actually deserve, you've humiliated yourself. How have you humiliated yourself? You've humiliated yourself.
Sorry, yeah, Joshua, this is very, very embarrassing. I mean, I expected better from you. So again, this hadith is fatal. This hadith is absolutely fatal for this revisionist hypothesis. And you can tell, he literally concedes it. There's nowhere for him to go. And yet he still refuses to acknowledge the impact of this hadith. He says it doesn't disprove anything. This proves your whole theory, bro. What are you... anyone who's honest, who's looking at this objectively, will concede that, yeah, the chronology doesn't match. He's likely referring to the first fitnah, almost certainly. When he uses the exact same lexical usage in the hadith of Ibn Sirin, he's most likely talking about the first fitnah. There's no way of getting around this. This, in combined with the other early usages that I've given, clearly show that he's talking about the first. So again, this is a slam dunk, as he would put it. Sorry. All right, now let's go to the next argument. What do you think about the arguments against Shach's chronology of the Isnad according to Motzki? And what are your thoughts on the following summary of Motzki's arguments relating to the question of when Isnads began? So I said here, even Motzki, who analyzed Isnads with modern statistics, found that some transmitters had already given Isnads into the 1st century, and they simply became the norm a few years later. So the idea that the entire corpus was invented after the year 70 has no empirical support whatsoever. And this is true. I stand by this. So he little says that Motzki criticized Shacht's interpretation and use of Ibn Sirin's hadith and some other evidence. Despite this, Motzki's origins ended up at least broadly affirming a timeline of Isnad usage that substantially agrees with that of Shacht and Juynboll's. So this is like half true. And I've seen like Chunk say this, but this is like only half true. Juynboll and Shacht don't believe there are any Isnads in the 1st century. They don't believe that. In fact, Shacht didn't believe there were any Isnads at all in the 1st century. He believed the whole thing was made up after. Motzki is refuting that. He's saying, no, there were early Isnads used in the 1st centuries, but they were used sparingly. That's what he's... Over time, this usage developed over time, and that by the time we reach Az-Zuhri, then we have the systemization of Isnad. All right? That's his chronology. Now, you can say that it agrees broadly in the sense that yes, there was kind of a sparing usage at the beginning and then a later proliferation later on. Sure, but the paradigm of Motzki is substantially different to that of Shacht and Juynboll. He doesn't believe in en masse workshop forgers. He doesn't believe that the common link is necessarily the forger. He doesn't believe in the over-reliance of negative evidence. His method of dating is completely different to that of Juynboll. So the assumptions and axioms of Motzki, even though you're right in the sense that he's agreeing with the chronology, but the assumptions and axioms of Motzki are completely different to that of Juynboll, which leads him to much more different. Yeah, so my comment is not misleading. It's objectively true. Motzki analyzed Isnads with Isnad's kun matan analysis, and he found that some transmitters had already given Isnads in the 1st century. And this is present, for example, in the letters of Urwa bin Zubair, which you rely on for your biography. Urwa doesn't cite Isnads constantly, but he does cite some Isnads, right? They don't have to be complete Isnads, but he does cite some Isnads, which shows that the practice existed in the 1st century, which refutes Shacht. So again, my statement here is 100% correct. I don't need to agree with Motzki's chronology. I can disagree with him and I can take what I want from Motzki and leave what I don't want. I'm not bound to agree with all of Motzki's positions just because I quote him when I want to refute other revisionists like Shacht and Juynboll. This is very silly. This is like saying you quoted Bart Ehrman to do with New Testament textual criticism, therefore you have to agree with Bart Ehrman on the problem of evil. I don't have to agree with Bart Ehrman on the problem of evil. Just because I quote him for textual criticism. Likewise here, I don't have to agree with Motzki on chronology just because I agree with him that Isnads existed in the 1st century, in contrast to what Juynboll and Schacht were saying. So here, Ustaz Little uses this report from Sa'id bin Jubair to try and support his hypothesis. And the report is here, where he says, who related this to you, or from whom did you hear this? And then he became enraged and refused to give his hadith. Right, and then Schacht tries to use this as evidence. And then he quotes Motzki. Even though Motzki refutes it, he still says that it supports the revisionist model. I mean, I quoted this in my video, which he watched, so I don't know why he's regurgitating something that's already been refuted. He's talking about the hadith of Ibn Sirin. Then he says, Schacht's other piece of evidence, however, does not do this either, meaning doesn't support his position. The tradition that Sa'id bin Jubair rebuked a listener who asked him for an isnad for a tradition implies only that at the end of the 1st century, there were people who demanded isnads. Consequently, there also must have been people who customarily named isnads, but that Sa'id bin Jubair, for unspecified reasons, refused this once. And he goes on to say, it can't be interpreted to mean that no isnads existed in the 1st century, or the custom wasn't generally prevalent, which refutes Schacht. So Motzki is refuting this piece of evidence, and yet Little still uses it. So who's misrepresenting Motzki? He just says, he cautions against generalizing from it. No, he doesn't just caution against generalizing from it. He explicitly refutes this. He says, this can't be used as evidence to support your model. This doesn't support your model at all. Motzki's calling you out, and you still use it. So it shows how dishonest you are. And he wants to accuse me of misrepresenting Motzki. It's crazy.
Oh, you see this guy? See this guy? Number 1 bullshit guy.
Now we get to the slam dunk, the be-all, end-all for Joshua. The argument he thinks is going to save his crumbling pieces of evidence. So what does he say? He says, this is a key piece of evidence to support Juynboll's revisionist model of isnads being blah, 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 blah. And he again cites the same hadith by Ibrahim al-Nakhaʿ. He goes on to say, this is a slam dunk for the revisionist hypothesis. It's a novel, independent, confirmatory piece of evidence that was unknown to the initial formulators of the hypothesis. It is strongly supported by the criterion of dissimilarity. It strongly confirms the interpretation of Ibn Sirin's fitnah hadith as a reference to the second fitnah. Both hadith use the same distinctive language and are clearly referring to the same event. Thus, we're strongly justified in interpreting the hadith of Ibn Sirin in light of the Ibrahim hadith, the latter of which, once again, is supported by the... Again, so he repeats the same point. So here, Ustaz Dr. Joshua Little tries to argue about Arabic grammar with someone who actually speaks Arabic. He's trying to argue about Arabic grammar with an Arab. Let's see how well this ends up for you, ya Ustaz Joshua. He tries to say that it was narrated from Ibrahim, who said, and Ibrahim قال, the isnad was only asked for, thus almost certainly excluded from being the deputy subject. This is not true. He says, if Ibrahim was the deputy subject, it would be, I was asked, su'iltu. He says that my reading is extremely unlikely and ungrammatical, and he then just says this is a simple matter of grammar. So, a number of points here. Variant morphology undermines the claim that this is an unambiguous text. And your own wording here, also talking about likelihoods, suggests that you would agree that my reading is not impossible, it is simply... But I'm going further than that. Not only saying is my reading possible, that my reading is actually the natural reading. Even if su'ilta is truly passive, the agent is unstated. The phrase can mean people started questioning isnads during Mukhtar's days, which is again an intensification of an already existing, it's not the origination of that trend. Now this attempt to say that the deputy subject is not Ibrahim is very weak. We have other examples that I'm going to put up on the screen, like this one, and this one, where the same clause is used and the same translation is given, which is again a passive subject is being incited. Saying that my usage is wrong or ungrammatical is again a straight... the grammar is again ambivalent. It can be read both ways. And based on the context, we know from all the other reports, we know that he's not saying this is the origin of isnad. Again, he's just saying that this is the intensification about asking for the isnads. On top of that, he tries to say that this hadith passes the criteria of dissimilarity and is therefore historical, and he gives all these reasons to say, he tries to say that we're justified in reading this hadith in light of the hadith of Ibn Sirin. I don't know how he reached that conclusion. Yeah, it seems like he's jumping from one report to another. Again, the hadith of Ibn Sirin is from a Basran. This hadith is a gloss from a Kufan. living about a century after. And he charges me with anachronism. Again, this is like the third time he's fell into anachronism. And then thirdly, he tries to say that this hadith is supported by the criteria of dissimilarity. Now, I want to understand that, because to me, this hadith can easily be rejected on your grounds as proto-Sunni propaganda. Why wouldn't you say that? This hadith is very clearly demonizing al-Mukhtar. It's citing him as the explicit reason for the fabrication of a hadith, implying that people are fabricating hadith as a result of al-Mukhtar, which is demonizing al-Mukhtar. So again, this hadith is actually very consistent with Sunni polemics, where someone invented or fabricated this hadith in order to demonize al-Mukhtar and blame him for the rise of fabrications of a hadith and the spread of misinformation. So how exactly does it pass the criteria of dissimilarity? If anything, it fails it. And I'm surprised you of all people are the one trying to claim that it passes the criteria of dissimilarity. The only reason he's saying this is, again, because he thinks this is a slam dunk. He thinks this supports his claim unambiguously. And this is false. It doesn't actually support his claim whatsoever, no matter which way we take it. So again, what do we have here? We have a single chain, which is defective, which is polemically useful, and which is anecdotal, which is supposed to override what? First century usage from Ibn Sirin himself, which is supposed to override the chronology that contradicts this theory, which is supposed to override the other early witnesses that also attest to the hadith being in reference to the first fitnah. What this second fitnah thesis now has to depend on is cherry picking one compromised report while dismissing the multiply attested independent contrary data. So whenever there's any data that contradicts you explicitly, what you're forced to do
is to start jumping through hoops to rationalize it, bending over backwards to try and fit it into your preconceived narrative, or to just simply dismiss it as irrelevant even though it explicitly contradicts your narrative. Ibn Sirin himself clarifies which fitnah he's talking about. Irrelevant. The earliest witnesses disagree with us. Irrelevant. The chronology doesn't match and it points to the usage being the first fitnah, not the second. Also irrelevant. This is an Oxford scholar. Wallahi, I don't know how the hell you got your degree, Joshua. Who the hell, what you did to get your degree, who you paid off, I don't know.
Do you ever look at someone and wonder what is going on inside their head?
He then says that the second attempt to dispose of the text, to claim that it is weak, amounts to little more than an uncritical appeal to Sunni ilm al-rijal. And then he says that weak hadith still embody genuine historical memory, regardless of whether it's corroborated or not. That al-Amash is a common link for the source. In other words, we can possibly trace the memory of the rise of Isnads back to a major hadith transmitter in early Kufa. Alright, so how do you know al-Amash didn't fabricate the report, according to your standard? According to your standard, how do you know al-Amash didn't fabricate this report? Again, it's very, very strange. It's very, very strange. Or how do you know one of the people in the chain didn't fabricate it and conspire and then project it onto al-Amash? How do you know that? What's the evidence that that didn't happen?
This was the big problem for me. How do you get around this problem? And I could never think of a good solution, right? So eventually you just have to go with the evidence, right? And then
this cherry picking is very, very embarrassing. I'm surprised you actually put out this report. People can see you cherry picking in 4K Ultra HD. It's very, very embarrassing, Joshua. Alright, so let's go to the final argument Ustaz Joshua brings. He says, the reason why people would want to say it's the first fitnah, of course, is that would mean that Isnads go back right to the earliest companions, directly after the time of the Prophet. That's the reason you'd want to say it's the first. If it's the second fitnah, Isnads are rising much later on, it's a bit more of a problem, right? There's more time for false material to have proliferated, and so on. By contrast, could it not be argued to you, psychologically you seek to postdate the origins of Isnad to the second fitnah in order to support a revisionist approach to the validity of the hadith sciences, since it would be very hard for you to argue that hadith are unreliable if isnads originate during the first. And this is the point that I give in my video. Let's see his response. He says, the inference that it would be very hard to argue that Islamic sources are unreliable if the tradition is speaking of the first fitnah is obviously invalid. For example, in my list of problems of the reliability and historicity of hadith, the belated rise of isnad is only one amongst the 25. So what you're saying here is,
I have other flawed reasons for why hadith are problematic, or why I see hadith are problematic. Thus, even positively trace many or even most hadith to the companions, it wouldn't change much. Only Sunni traditionalists think that the hadiths deriving from the companions grant it some type of special reliability. As far as I can tell, no one else thinks that. In other words, if an obviously fake hadith derives from a companion, then it follows that the companion was falsified or was duped by someone else's falsification, not that suddenly the hadith is reliable. Yeah, so again, this is a straw man of our position. We don't say like the companions are magical and that they're inerrant or they're... No, we don't say this. And we have, for example, in our own tradition, narrations where Umar, for example, is critical towards Abu Hurairah, and he wants to make sure that what Abu Hurairah is saying is correct. So very clearly, Umar does not believe that Abu Hurairah is infallible or he doesn't make mistakes. No, he's being critical of Abu Hurairah, and he gets other people to corroborate what he's saying because he says, oh, I'm not sure about this. So even within our own tradition, we don't believe the companions are ma'sumin or infallible or magical or anything like this. So this is the obvious straw man. But yeah, I mean, the first point here is actually kind of funny because he did this before. He says he's just happy to dismiss evidence that disagrees with him on the basis that, oh, I have other flawed reasons for why I should think what I think.
Sorry to say, this is the same mentality as the evangelical Christians who say that God put fossils there to test us. He put contradictory evidence in front of us just to test us. It's the same mentality, the way they dismiss the evidence a priori, because they're so certain that their preconceived narrative has to be true.
Oh, and for a detailed refutation of Joshua's 25 additional flawed reasons for rejecting hadith, make sure to check out Brother Fareed's video where he goes in depth refuting each one of them. I definitely recommend it. The link will be in the description.
And notice he doesn't actually respond to the point. He says, well, you see, we have other reasons for believing hadith are unreliable. Yeah, those other flawed reasons have already been refuted, but you haven't actually addressed my point. You psychologically want to say that the hadith are unreliable. You want to say the hadith, the Isnad, came later. The reason why you want to say this is very clear, because you think this makes the hadith more unreliable and it gives precedence to your revisionist theory. Once I show that those arguments are nonsensical and that the Isnad did arise and was there at the time of the companion, the fact remains that it is harder for you now to posit that this mass fabrication, distortion, contamination occurred, because there were people who are eyewitnesses to the events who are there to check over the material to make sure no false material proliferates. So this response amounts to basically a straw man of our position, trying to say that we believe like the companions are infallible when our own tradition explicitly refutes this notion. And then just a sidestep of the actual charge, just saying, oh, me trying to undermine hadith tradition, me, no, why would I want to do that? I have other reasons for thinking that, no. So the final paragraph of this embarrassing response, he just gives like a nice little shubha for you guys. So he says, in fact, it is interesting to note that even taken at face value, the majority of isnads are technically mursal or munqati', since the companions or companion source isn't explicitly present as an eyewitness, and this is known, for example, and then he cites Brown. Now, citing Brown here is very, very strange. First of all, does Brown believe that this is an article of faith? No, he doesn't. Does Brown believe this is problematic? That the companions would just say Qala Rasulullah instead of saying I heard Rasulullah, because this was common. This is how you speak. Even today, I say the boss said stay home, or the boss said don't come to work. Maybe I didn't hear it explicitly from the boss. I heard it from a colleague or whatever. But the fact is, the boss said it. I don't need to give you my isnad, because there's no need for this. There's no issue here. And Brown doesn't see it as an issue. So I don't know why you're citing Brown specifically. He says it's munqati' or mursal. And this is a misclassification. In the classical usage of the term, an isnad is only called mursal once it reaches a companion, whether or not the companion was an eyewitness. So Brown's line, it's just simply restating that modern academics use the eyewitness in a more strict sense. It doesn't relabel that most canonical isnads are actually structurally broken. This is a misunderstanding of the terms that he's using. He doesn't actually understand the terms. The actual studies that have been done show that, for example, if you read Motzki's work on the Sahifat of Hammam, and for example, Imam Malik's Muwatta, and for example, the Ibn Uyayna corpus, he says, or even like the early Musannaf material, he notes that like 70 to like 85% of prophetic reports have continuous companion links. The minority of reports are mursal, and this is far from most. So when he says like most reports are actually mursal, this is incorrect on like multiple levels. This is actually compounded ignorance. He then goes on to say like nothing stops Abu Hurairah from retelling anonymous stories he heard later. And this is false. We have internal controls. So, for example, the very distinction between Mursal and Musnad was invented by early Basrans like Ibn Sirin and Qatada. They were the ones who were controlling for the material that was being proliferated. Furthermore, we have examples of companions flagging suspicious reports. They say this report is gharib, like I haven't heard this before, this is a strange report. And we have many instances of this being documented. So it's not like the companions weren't aware of this. He then says, formal transmission overwhelmingly terminates with someone operating in the mid-1st century. So again, he's just regurgitating Shahti. Like, really, when I tell Chong on Twitter, Little just regurgitates Shacht, he tells me, no, what do you mean? He doesn't. Bro, this is literally Shacht like regurgitated. Have you read Shacht's work? He literally says, the reason why hadith are fabricated in the 8th century is because this is where the common link ends. Therefore, like, that's where it's fabricated. So again, it's just assuming the common link is the fabricator without any evidence. Except he's just pushing it a little bit later. Instead of the 2nd century, he's saying it's the mid to late 1st century. And he says this leaves a pre-Isnad chasm of anonymous or informational transmission for half a century or more back to the Prophet. So he's saying this leaves a gap that has to be filled in by back projection, essentially. That's his claim. And this is very silly because we have people like, again, the Sahifat of Hammam ibn Munabbih, which is, again, supposedly written 60 to 70, which Motzki accepts as authentic, and is written by a companion, which is not anonymous, right? And we have other transmissions like that are written within the time that Little is claiming there's this gap, which explicitly fill it in.
And I think that's pretty much everything. I mean, this was the end of his embarrassing response. And to be honest, I'm not really impressed by it. And I don't think anyone outside of his little Reddit boot-looking circle is impressed with it.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
So with that all being said, let's summarize today's events. I think it's clear to anyone who's watching that my initial objections to Joshua's proposed revisionist chronology still stand, my criticism of his evidence still stands, and his objections to my criticisms really don't hold any weight. To summarize, Ustaz Joshua's account of the origins of Isnads rests on a chain of selective filters, circular assumptions, and concessions that quietly cast glaring holes into his account of the origins of Isnad. He concedes that the hadith about the 10,000 companions is probably genuine, but yet disregards it in favor of additional perceived evidences which are in fact flawed, as I've demonstrated today. He accepts that Ibn Sirin, in at least one authentic saying, used the word fitnah without qualification in reference to the saying of Uthman, yet disregards that as well for other perceived flawed evidences. He also concedes that the account given by Juynboll is undermined by the facts that I've presented today, and yet despite all of these concessions, he still maintains his position, which is a sign of dishonesty. In contrast, the traditional account of the origins of Isnad requires no special pleading or circular reasoning, and uses the same evidentiary standard for both Basran and Kufan material. In addition, the traditional model is more parsimonious with the evidence, which consists of a mix of partial and complete Isnads in the 1st century, and then a sharpening of vetting formulas in the early 2nd century compilations, exactly what the manuscripts display. Ustaz Joshua's position rests on cherry-picking evidence, downplaying authentic 1st century documents, and declaring early Basran testimony as anachronistic. It also rests on misapplying the criteria of dissimilarity and ignoring any and all contrary data. Until Ustaz Joshua can respond to these problems with convincing evidence, the traditional account stands. And more than that, we are justified in dismissing and ridiculing these revisionist Orientalists. So don't shy away from calling out their inconsistency, their hypocrisy, their circular reasoning, their flawed assumptions, and their inconsistent methodology. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
اتسم واستطال ودور الأمجاد طالما تولى بادلا نفس وملا طال إليك شهابا يلهي بالأرض اشتعالا في غبار الحرب يبدو مثل بدر يتنالى.
You are a propagandist and you are a seal. See, this is what other people don't know as well. These guys, academia, and I can tell you, I know Christians in academia, I know Muslims in academia, I know atheists in academia. Okay, some of them are my friends. I know them. I talk to them before they publish works. I know plenty of stories. I have people come to me and say, Jake, look, this is my position, and you know it, but I can't publish on it because I don't have tenure. Wallahi, I've had people tell me that. So you don't even see the reality of what some of these people think. You think it's all intellectual, that, you know, this idea of the academy and Western scholarship and Western academia, that this is, you know, going for the PhD, and this is without any motivation, without any biases, without any hidden agendas from funding and federal government and all this kind of stuff. No, it's just purely intellectual enterprise. Get the hell out of here. Nobody's believing that. This is not a conspiracy theory. I've had them tell me directly, Jake, I can't publish on it because I don't have tenure. I'll get fired. Wallahi. You see? And these people, they have agendas, because when they're in their private rooms and talking, guess what? Some of the people who are around you, they don't like you. So they tell you they tell us what you guys are saying. We know what you're saying behind closed doors, what you're trying to do. So don't get it confused, because we are not fools. We know what you're doing.